returning to our series on evaluating good and evil moral choices based on the Ten Commandments. And we are on the fifth commandment, which is, you shall not kill. Pretty straightforward. Moving on. There's other passages immediately after the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus that clarify what is meant by the fifth commandment. And shortly after Moses receives the Ten Commandments, God tells him, do not slay the innocent and the righteous. So this gives a further definition to, and it sort of narrows the fifth commandment to the deliberate murder of an innocent person. And this, as we shall see, is what gives, exceptions for self-defense and soldiers fighting and enemy combatants and things like that. Once we get to the New Testament, though, Jesus expands the fifth commandment to include a whole lot more. He says, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Now, why is Jesus so generous with the fifth commandment that he even includes being angry in the fifth commandment? Well, it's because of the value and the dignity of human life. The Catechism says this: human life is sacred because from its beginning it involves the creative action of God, and it remains forever in a special relationship with the Creator, who is its sole end. God alone is the Lord of life from its beginning until its end. No one can under any circumstance claim for himself the right directly to destroy an innocent human being. So while not many of us are probably have to consider whether or not we've been guilty of murder, I would also wager that not many of us are innocent of anger. When Jesus talks about the fifth commandment, he asks us to remove hatred and anger from our hearts. Anger is a desire for revenge. Jesus says, everybody who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Deliberate hatred is against the fifth commandment. Anger as an emotion is just an emotion. Emotions are sins. But hatred becomes a sin when you deliberately wish evil upon someone. Jesus says, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. That's quite the challenge. But it's an indisputable commandment from God himself to love our enemies. The reason that Jesus includes anger with the fifth commandment is because things like anger and envy, they lead to sins against the dignity of life. In the very first case of murder, in fact, with Cain and Abel, it's done out of Cain's envy for Abel's relationship with God the Father. And this is such an offense against God that Cain is banished for the rest of his life. The sacredness of life is there from the very beginning. It's literally foundational to everything that we believe as Catholics. Just listen to the words of the gospel that we just heard. Jesus is praying to his Father. This is his prayer before he is arrested after the Last Supper. It takes up several chapters in John's gospel, but he says, I revealed your name to those who you gave me out of the world. They belonged to you, and you gave them to me. We belong to God. That's why we take the defense of life so seriously, because we are God's. What about legitimate self-defense? I will be addressing war and capital punishment in future homilies when I'm talking about Catholic social teaching, so I'll leave those alone for now. But generally speaking, legitimate defense of self is, or your loved ones or society, even at the cost of someone else's life, is permissible. Sometimes preserving your own life can have the side effect of taking another life. The key here is the killing of the other is the side effect, not the goal. It isn't the point. Protecting life is the point. So someone who defends their life is not guilty of murder, not murder in fact at all. In fact, preserving the common good requires that we put an end to aggressors' unjust actions. So if self-defense isn't murder, what is? Murder is the direct and intentional killing of another person. But the fifth commandment covers far more ground than simple murder. So we have to move beyond that. The fifth commandment prohibits exposing somebody to mortal danger, or refusing assistance to a person that's in danger, if we just accept things like famines and genocides without making efforts to fix those things, it's a serious contradiction against the virtue of justice. Fifth commandment obviously prohibits abortion. Human life has to be respected absolutely from the moment of conception, from the first moment of your existence. You have the rights of a person. If we start drawing a line, what does that say about what it means to be a person? Including the right of every innocent being to life. And this has been church teaching since the very first century, since the very beginning. It has remained unchanged and remains unchangeable. I know the news, the media really likes to speculate on which pope is going to reverse the church's teaching on abortion. And spoiler alert, none of them ever will. Because it's unchangeable. The Catechism says this regarding civil law and abortion. The moment a law deprives a category of human beings of the protection which civil legislation ought to accord them, the state is denying the equality of all before the law. When the state does not place its power at the service of the rights of each citizen, and in particular of the more vulnerable, the very foundations of a state based on law are undermined. So those are strong words. When laws are passed that deny the equality of all people, the very foundation of that nation is undermined. The next topic regarding the fifth commandment is euthanasia, or so-called mercy killing. The elderly, the sick, the weak, they deserve special respect and special protections, and they should be assisted by those who, live with them to have as normal of a life as possible. Euthanasia is the opposite of doing that. It's putting an end to the lives of the handicapped, the sick, or the dying, and it's morally unacceptable. It is murder. And it is a slippery slope that leads down some very dark alleys in the worst parts of human history. Think of the eugenics of the Nazi Party. It kind of begins with euthanasia as an idea. However, on the other hand, discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome or risky or extraordinary or extreme compared to what is likely to be the outcome, that can be a legitimate thing. It is legitimate to refuse treatment. Putting a 98-year-old on chemotherapy might not be the best or most realistic thing for them. And in these cases, the action or the inaction, the purpose isn't to cause death, but to rather accept death, which we must all do in the end. And these decisions should be made by the patient, or if they're unable, the patient's caretakers, power of attorney, that kind of thing, which means that medical professionals, they're not the ones that can force a patient to undergo a particular treatment or procedure. Obviously, they should be consulted, but it is up to the person themselves. So if you ever have any questions about the morality of a medical procedure, I would recommend asking a priest in addition to your doctor, because they might have different views on it. We come from a spiritual perspective of the health of the soul, not just the body. But generally speaking, when it comes to end-of-life issues, the rule of thumb is that if it requires a medical device, you have the option of declining the treatment or the care or the procedure and to simply accept a natural death. Other factors can play into it. Do you have a family? Do you have children who depend on you? Perhaps you feel that you owe it to them to fight as hard as you can what could be a terminal illness, but even then, you can choose to end medical treatment when you so desire. In any case, ordinary care, such as cleanliness, food, water, those, if they can be provided, they must be provided. And palliative care is a special form of charity, and so it's an admirable thing. Walking with somebody in their last days and their last hours it's difficult, but it is filled with grace. Next, the fifth commandment addresses suicide. Everybody is responsible for the life that God has given them because God is the Lord of life. All life belongs to Him in the end. We're merely stewards of this life that we've been given. We're here to care for life and to preserve it. We don't own the life that God has entrusted to us, and therefore it's not ours to dispose of. But God is also the God of mercy, so we shouldn't fear for the eternal salvation of people who have taken their own lives. We should certainly intercede for them. Things like mental health issues, they can compromise our ability to make rational choices and thus reduce our culpability. And in many cases, mental health issues make it seem like there is no choice. There is no other option. The example that I always use is that, a majority of survivors who attempted to end their lives by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge report that on the way down they regretted their decision. The human will to live persists, even in major mental struggles. And so God can work with what little we have, even if that tiny desire to live is there. In the Catechism, it beautifully says this: by ways known to him alone, God can provide the opportunity for repentance. And so that's why we pray for all the dead, even those who have taken their own lives. The fifth commandment also includes having respect for your own health. So life and physical health, they are gifts entrusted to us by God, and so we have to take reasonable care of them. That extends to society as a whole. So a nation ought to have concern for the health of its citizens when it comes to things like living conditions and food and clean water and clothing and housing and healthcare and education and things like that. However, having respect for life and health in the body doesn't mean that we worship the body, which is kind of what we see nowadays. It's really prevalent in today's world. I think it's because of social media, where so much emphasis is placed on how you look. But that's a dangerous thing, because when we place things like appearance or ability or sports or competition as the perfection of human achievement, then often, as history shows us, that leads to the marginalization of the weak. But generally speaking, the virtue of health calls us to avoid excess. We can enjoy such things, but the abuse of food or alcohol or tobacco or medicine, it's contrary to the dignity of the human person and the body that God gave us, especially if those things lead to endangering our lives. Or other lives, for example, drunk driving. And unless it's for therapeutic reasons, for health reasons, the use of drugs is considered grave matter because it does damage to human health and human life. And so obviously, producing, selling, or trafficking drugs is included in the fifth commandment. The fifth commandment also addresses the dignity of the human person when it comes to scientific research. This is in the Catechism as well. And it might not be the first thing that we think of when it comes to thou shalt not kill, but it does apply here. So scientific, medical, or psychological experiments on human individuals or groups of people, they can contribute to bettering lives. This is how we make medical advancements. Science and technology, they're resources that are given to us by God. God is the God of nature, so he's the God of science. He gave us the ability to reason. And so they're precious. And he entrusted them to us when he gave us dominion over the earth and its creatures. But just because something is scientifically advantageous or it makes life more efficient, it doesn't legitimize it. Science and technology, by their very nature, require unconditional respect for the human person and for human rights. This is a really big topic right now at this moment in history because AI is threatening to wipe out entire sectors of the job market that may never exist again. And Pope Leo just signed his first encyclical, which is on artificial intelligence. I'm eager to read it once it's translated into English. I think he knows a little bit English, though, so it should be fast. But back to scientific research. So research or experimentation on the human person can't do so in ways that is contrary to the dignity of the person or human sexuality or anything like that, even if the subject consents to it, and especially if they don't consent to it, obviously. For example, organ transplants are legitimate, when the subject says so, and they can be seen as a noble thing, but it has to be consented to. That's why it's a box that we check when we get our driver's license. It's something that we consent to. It doesn't just automatically happen when we die. It's still our bodies. The fifth commandment, speaking of which, also includes having respect for the dead. The dying should be given attention and care to help them live their last moments in dignity and in peace, while also at the same time receiving what the church has to offer in terms of last rites or communion and confession, anointing of the sick. And then once death has taken place, the bodies of the dead must be treated with respect in the hope of the resurrection. And as I've said in a previous homily not that long ago, burying the dead is a corporal work of mercy. And it honors those created in the image and likeness of God. So things like autopsies are allowed for legal or scientific research at the request of the family. Contrary to what many people think, the church does permit creation. In fact, it actually, on the front cover of the ritual for funerals, it says, with creation, or cremation rite. So it's on there. It's literally on the cover of the book. As long as the cremains are shown respect, so that includes the burial of the ashes and not scattering them. A place of burial gives people a place to visit and to pray and a place to grieve. And when we have them in a place, it is to do so with respect to anticipating the resurrection of the dead. There's a list of other things that are prohibited by the fifth commandment. Things like kidnapping and hostage taking and terrorism and torture and slavery. I don't think I need to go into detail with those. If we do, I think we have problems. But the final thing that the Catechism addresses with the fifth commandment is peace. Peace does not just mean the absence of war. Peace is about maintaining, or it's not about, maintaining an arms race with adversaries. So there's there's equality there. Peace is attained by safeguarding the dignity of people. So it is tied to the fifth commandment. If everyone had everything they needed, spiritually, mentally, physically, peace would be a lot more attainable in this world. Peace comes from justice. First of all, justice means that people have received what they're owed as human beings, and peace also comes from charity, where we act out of love for our neighbor. But we also have to acknowledge that peace is not a man-made thing. We will never achieve a utopia for ourselves. Peace comes from Jesus Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. Peace comes, kind of ironically, from his blood that he shed on the cross. And in doing so, he declares, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So that's the fifth commandment. Let's do the examination of conscience. Have I had an abortion or encouraged anyone to have an abortion? Have I promoted pro-abortion causes or persons? Have I physically harmed anyone? Have I wished evil upon another person? Have I treated beggars and others in need with charity? Have I abused alcohol or drugs? Have I been angry or resentful? Have I harbored hatred in my heart? Have I mutilated myself or harmed myself in any way?